So, is your wealth at a crossroads? There's been, I would call it probably the most hyperbolic level of vernacular and tone to this election cycle, at least in my lifetime. Maybe in other lifetimes there has been the level of contentiousness and hyperbolic speech that we're seeing today. But there really is a lot of concern on people's minds. Depending on what side of the aisle you're on, the other party it's a very contentious period of time. So we're going to discuss it today, but first, quick disclaimer, anything you hear from us today is just educational in nature. Please don't act on any type of implied advice without talking to either us specifically about your situation or someone who knows your situation who can provide you expert advice. All right, so here's the agenda for today. What should we expect in the next 6 weeks leading up to the election? What are some potential tax changes and their effects on your wealth? This is a big one. What are some pre- and post-election investment portfolio positioning things you either should or should not do? And lastly, how the outcome may actually impact your retirement plans and your wealth. Hopefully when you leave today, you'll have a good sense of that. Before we get into that, let's look at what the current situation is. So in the last, really the last 4 years, we've had a balance of power where the presidency is Democrat, the U.S. Senate, slim majority is Democrat, and the House of Representatives is Republican. So you'll see that there in terms of what seats each of them currently hold. And when we look at the upcoming election, this is what's likely to happen, or at least prognosticators are saying, in the House. So as a quick reminder, if you haven't brushed up on your 8th grade civics in a while, the House of Representatives consists of 435 members. Each of those seats is up for re-election every 2 years. So in theory, you could have every 2 years a completely different House with completely different members. Obviously, we know that's not what happens. A lot of House members, because there are no term limits, keep their seats for many, many years and decades, some of them. But this is the current makeup from the prognosticators of what seats are solidly Republican. There's 192 seats that are pretty much going to be Republican at the end of the day. And then 173 seats that are likely to be Democrat after the election. Now, if you see at the bottom, okay, you see which seats, that means there's, 50 seats that are kind of up for grabs according to polling data. Of those 50, about 30 are leaning or likely Democrat, and about 18 are likely or leaning Republican, and there's 22 toss-ups. So we'll discuss in a minute what the betting odds are of what the House of Representatives is likely to be. Okay? But let's look at the Senate for a minute. The Senate is 100 members, in which those seats are for 6-year terms. So of those 100 members, there's, I want to say, I forget the exact number that are up for election. I think it's 30-something. But of those, 14 are solidly Democrat, 10 are solidly Republican. The likely Democrat and leaning Democrat is about 5 and 2, and there's 3 toss-ups. One of the things that you notice is that there are more, by about 10, more seats, Republican seats, that are not up for re-election. All right, moving on. So what will likely the balance of power be after the election? Again, these are all probabilities, but what I like to do is look at essentially the betting odds. Instead of polls, which can vary greatly, betting odds, there's actually money at risk, and people are making financial bets. So they tend to be a little bit more accurate, I guess, or less wavering to the kind of polling data. So based upon Polymarket, which is a betting odds site, currently, as it stands today, the presidency is slightly leaning Democrat. We'll talk about that in a minute. The Senate there's a 75% chance opportunity that the Senate will be Republican after the election. That's according to the betting odds. And if you remember what we just went over, because there's less Senate seats, Republican Senate seats that are up for election, that's what starts to fill that in. And then the House currently is leaning a 63% chance of it being a Democrat House. So in other words, what's likely to happen is the House and the Senate will flip, and you'll have a Republican Senate and a Democrat House. The presidency is still a toss-up, too close to call. We'll discuss that in a minute. The reason this is important is because any proposed legislative changes, any tax policies, any governing policies, anything has to go through the House of Congress before it can be passed into law. And when you have a split House and Senate, we all know what that's like. Things get log-jammed, more gridlock. But what also happens is it's less likely for any specific party's agenda to get pushed through the entire, unless there's a true monopoly of power, unless you have a sweep of all Republicans or all Democrats. And the odds of that happening right now, based upon the betting sites, are a 28% chance of a Republican sweep having the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And there's a 21% chance of the Democrats having the House, the Senate, and the presidency. Both of those situations are a pretty small percentage chance. And so what that probably means is that even after November, when all is said and done, we'll probably still have a divided government, which some people feel good about that, some people get frustrated with that. But at the end of the day, it probably means that no real radical, full-scale changes in either to the right or the left are likely to happen. All right, real quick, the betting odds currently on U.S. President. This has been changing. As of right now, Harris, according to Real Clear Politics, as of yesterday, Harris has a slight advantage in the betting odds. According to Polymarket, Harris has a small chance, or the higher probability. All right, so now that we've covered kind of what might likely happen, let's shift gears a little bit. We're entering the final stretch of election season. And so there's a lot of pushing and pulling that's going on both in the media, but also possibly in the markets. And let's discuss that. So what should we expect? Well, as you know, history is our best guide. History may not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And so if we look at historical data, what should we expect, particularly in the markets? Well, this chart is a chart showing volatility, okay, measured by the VIX, which is the volatility index. And what it shows is that the red line here, okay, is the average of election years throughout history. And so what you see is, in the result of this data, is that in this period of time here, okay, from about mid-September to election day, there is generally a spike in volatility. Okay, volatility just simply means larger than expected moves of the market. That could be positive, it could be negative. But it's highly likely, I think, that we're going to start feeling some enhanced volatility the closer and closer we get to election day. All right? Now, volatility many times is assumed and is market sell-offs. So could we get some market sell-off? Sure. When we get market sell-offs, remember the media, everything kind of gets exacerbated. And what are they going to talk about? They're going to talk about, oh, fear of recession, fear of uncertainty, fear of this, fear of that, geopolitical fears, etc. And immediately when that starts happening, people think we may be heading to recession. One of my favorite quotes of all time, in market quotes, is by an MIT professor, Paul Samuelson, who has said, the stock market has accurately predicted 9 out of the last 5 recessions, which is kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of saying that, yes, when markets start going a little haywire, there's a lot of talk about, oh, recession's coming, but it doesn't always play out that way. So the question we always get is, which party is better for markets? And depending on who you ask, usually whatever their political leanings are, especially if there's a highly politicized conversation around it, you're going to get one answer versus a different answer. Again, I just like data. I don't care about the biases. And so let's look at the data on which party is better for the market and the economy. So this dates back to 1947, and it looks at market performance in different types of governance years. And what we see is most of the time it's been a divided government, okay? So some form of, Democrat, Republican, either House, Senate, presidency, where there's not a complete alignment of the parties in the House, Senate, and presidency. So 61% of the time it's been a divided government. The average, this is GDP growth, so economic growth, not market performance. The average GDP growth during that time is 2.7%. 29% of the time out of this historical data, there has been a Democratic full majority. And the GDP growth, average GDP growth during that political makeup has been an average of 4%. The Republican majority has only been 10% of the time, so a smaller data sample, and the average has been a 2.8% GDP growth. So, marinate on that a second. We're going to look at one other chart, and then I have some thoughts about it. This next chart is stock market S&P 500 returns in the same context. So again, 61% of the time there's been a divided government. The average market return in the divided government periods have been 8.3%. 29% of the time has been Democrat, a 9.3% average return. And then the 10% of the time, 12.9% Republican. So, depending upon your political leanings, you're likely to come away with different interpretations of this data. The Republicans might say, see, Republican administrations gives you better market performance. That may be true. The thing I'd caution you against is that there's only a 10% of the time data sample, and statistically speaking, that's not a large enough data sample to get truly accurate results. The Democrats might say that, see, GDP growth, okay, is 4%, is the highest under Democratic administrations. The challenge with that is, and also with this other market data, is that political power can only really impact fiscal policy. It can impact, or shouldn't impact, monetary policy. And there are a number of other factors that get thrown into the mix, not just simply political power and who's in office. The takeaway I get from this is, historically speaking, regardless of the parties in power, the market has performed well over time, and the economy has performed well over time. And I believe that should be your takeaway as well. And what I'll caution you against is kind of going to the ends of the spectrum of political leanings and the hyperbolic nature that you might hear from both parties and both contestants. Because the data shows that it doesn't have a tremendous impact on your wealth, your money, your growth over time. All right? And if that disappoints any of you, I'm sorry. That's just the way it is. But there are incredible amounts of emotions in political years and election years. Anecdotally, this just seems to me like there's a whole lot more emotion involved than in other political and presidential election years. I don't know what the reason for that is. Maybe it's social media. Maybe it's the parties that are involved. There's a lot of probably reasons why, but there's a lot of hyperbolic commentary that you hear, and I'll caution you against that. One of the questions we always hear, and this is an emotional question. So if, fill in the blank, if so-and-so wins, should I sell and should I go to cash? If Trump wins, or if Harris wins, whatever it is, what should I do? I think I should sell and go to cash. I'm fearful of a blank presidency. I'm fearful of a, Democrats in power or Republicans in power. Here is what I'm trying to get through and help people understand is that there's incredible risk in making an emotional decision like that. Now, what I'll tell you is this time different? Maybe. Maybe this time is different. Maybe I'm just not seeing the potential risks. But there's a quarter of a millennium of U.S. history that at least we can draw from to say, you know what? The republic will go on. And the republic will survive. And we still will grow. The U.S. economy is this huge animal. And we'll probably be okay. But let's just look at history and what would have happened. If there's any chart that I think you should come away with and should grip you out of this presentation, it's this one. Because this is showing, dating back to 1945, if you'd have taken $10,000, and if you would have only invested that $10,000 during a period when your political party was in power, where would that have gotten you over that period? So, if you would have only invested, you invest $10,000 in the 40s when the Democratic Party was in power, and then when the Republicans came in power, you took your money out and went to cash. Then you went back in when Republicans got in power, Democrats in power, and took it out again. And then when another Democratic went in power, you put it back in. That's what we're showing here, and vice versa for the Republican administrations. What it means is you would have lost significant amounts of money relative to your opportunity. You would have ended up, only when Democrats were in office, $239,758, and only when Republicans were in office, $100,000. Some of you might be going, well, wait a minute. You just showed me data that said that the Republicans did better performance in the market than Democrats. Keep in mind, there's time periods involved here, and there's one additional Democrat administration involved here as well. But the real takeaway is, had you just implemented a buy and hold strategy, invested money without the fear and anxieties of who was in power, and left it invested, it's not that you just would have had more money. Look at the amount more you would have had. It's unbelievable, the difference. So when you're making an investment decision with a high level of emotion, there's a huge amount of impact, negative impact, that it could have to you your wealth, your future, and your retirement. This, hopefully, if nothing else, gives you second thought to thinking that you should make drastic, large-scale moves either pre-election or post-election. So now let's look at the tax impacts a little bit, okay? Based upon tax proposals of Trump and Harris. So let's first start with the corporate tax rate, okay? The tax rate imposed on corporations for income they earn. The current corporate tax rate is 21%. Trump has proposed a 20% corporate tax rate and a kind of a footnote here, a 15% corporate tax rate for companies that make their products in the U.S. How that's actually determined or not, there's really no specifics there at this point yet. Vice President Harris has proposed a 28% corporate tax rate. Okay, so that's a significant difference from the current. Trump is slightly lower, somewhat on par with the current corporate tax rate. Capital gains and dividend rates. Okay, so quick recap. Money that you earn in a long-term capital gain, which is defined as being held for longer than 1 year, and dividends, qualified dividends, in other words, stock dividends from Coke or Pepsi, something like that, those are taxed at a different tax rate depending upon your income. So there's either a zero tax rate on capital gains and dividends, or 15%, or the highest rate is 20%. Okay? So Trump has not proposed any changes to the capital gains and dividend rates. Vice President Harris has proposed an additional rate, okay, so you still have, from what I can understand, the 0, the 15, and the 20% rate, but also now a 28% rate for income over $1 million. And then one little piece that not a lot of people remember is that there's also a surtax that gets placed on capital gains and dividends. Okay? And that was back, I think in 2013, it was implemented when the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, came about. There's a net investment income tax, or the Obamacare surtax, that gets placed on top of dividends, capital gains. That currently, I believe, is 3.8%, if I remember correctly. Vice President Harris has proposed that 3.8%, which occurs once you exceed $250,000 of capital gain and dividend income. She has proposed a 5% threshold of income over $400,000. So at $250,000, you still get the 3.8%. At $400,000, you get another 5%. So conceptually, the top capital gain and dividend rate under what Harris has proposed is 28 plus 5%, or 33%. So that's a significant change to current tax law. One thing I'll also mention, the reason this is important, a lot of people will think, okay, tax 28% income over $1 million, well, that's not me. Even highly wealthy people may not have that amount of dividend or capital gain income. But what it does affect is, for instance, we have clients that are going through transitions right now where they're selling a business. They've worked in a business for an entire lifetime, and part of their retirement plan is selling a business. Well, in that regard, that capital gain, a lot of times the business might be $1 million, $2, $3, $4 million or something. Well, that's all now going to exceed, if this were to come into place, over that $1 million threshold. So all of a sudden, those types of transactions could be significantly different from a tax perspective if that policy went through. Okay, individual income taxes. It's very important for everyone to understand that the Tax Cut and Job Act expires at the end of 2025. We've done a lot on this. Hopefully this is not the first time you've heard this, but you need to pay attention to it. We certainly are, and we'll keep you abreast of it. So Donald Trump has proposed that the Tax Cut and Job Act, those income cuts, so in other words, all the income tax rates and thresholds went down and changed. So essentially, all of them went down. He wants to make that permanent instead of them expiring at the end of 2025. The other thing he wants to consider, and I have no idea how this would even come about, and I think it's actually a very low likelihood, but he wants to consider replacing the whole income tax system with tariffs. So in other words, you and I don't pay any income tax. The federal government receives its revenues from tariffs, not from income taxes. That would be a very significant change from current law, and I think the likelihood of that coming about is probably next to zero, but who knows? He's also proposed removing the itemized deduction on state and local taxes. So right now, if you itemize your deductions on your tax form, there's a cap that was a part of the Tax Cut and Job Act of $10,000 that you can deduct on state and local taxes, things like your property taxes and such. Well, a lot of high tax states like New Jersey, California, New York went up in arms about this because all of a sudden the property taxes in those states were capped at the deduction of $10,000, and a lot of people have a lot more than that. So that's something that is, I think there's a lot of momentum for that being removed, frankly. Another Trump proposal is that Social Security benefits would be tax-free. And candidly, I don't even think a lot of people are aware that when you start drawing Social Security, those aren't tax-free benefits. You're paying tax on that Social Security income you're receiving. And that's a whole other topic that maybe we'll go into a different day. Steve has done a whole webinar on this that's on our website. But he's proposed, Trump has proposed making Social Security benefits tax-free, which is an interesting concept that we'll see how much legs that has. He's also mentioned tip income to be tax-free and overtime pay tax-free. Okay, if we look at Harris' proposals as of currently, she has proposed that tip income would be tax-free. She's proposed expanding the child tax credit to $6,000 or $3,600 or $3,000 on thresholds. An expansion of the earned income tax credit. She wants to increase the $5,000 deduction for business startup costs from $5,000 to $50,000, which is significant. She wants to expand premium tax credits. So in other words, those are the tax credits that you receive when you get your health care from the healthcare exchange based upon income thresholds. And she wants to expand other credits like low-income housing, new home buyer, etc. So not a lot of information, at least currently, on what would happen with the Tax Cut and Job Act under a Harris presidency. Without mention of it, leads you to think that a Harris administration might let those expire as is. Again, something to keep a very close eye on. And then estate taxes, the last thing we'll cover on this tax proposal. Currently, there is an exclusion of $13.6 million per person of wealth or total assets when you pass away that can be transferred to your heirs. So I could die with $13.6 million of assets, and my heirs receive that without paying any estate tax. Okay? A married couple has double that. So over 27 million. All right? Now, this is also set to expire at the end of 2025 with the Tax Cut and Job Act expiration. And it's likely that, based upon some of the calculations we've done, that it may land somewhere around, because it reverts to the old law, $7 million Now, that's a significant difference. Now, portability of, so a married couple would have, in that case, 14 million, not the 27 million, but it's a significant difference. So again, the Trump proposal is to make that permanent, so carry that higher exclusion amount forward. There has been no comments, at least in the things that I've read and researched, the different reporting that Vice President Harris has made on whether to carry forward that or not. So that's a quick rundown. Now, as we think through those tax proposals, this is why we hit that so hard. Oh, real quick detour, quick plug. All this Tax Cut and Job Act stuff was written about in a blog article Steve wrote recently. I encourage you to check it out on our website. It's a great article, goes in a lot more depth than I just shared. Okay, why are taxes important, particularly as it relates to economic growth and such? So, according to the Tax Foundation, they took 3 different studies throughout the last 10 or 15 years to determine what the effect of a tax decrease is on GDP or economic growth. And so the takeaway is that 1% of a decrease, not 1% in the rate, 1% of a decrease in tax revenue as a share of gross domestic product. But as taxes decrease, economic growth increases, is what the studies show. That makes logical sense. If I pay less taxes, I have more money in my pocket. And if I have more money in my pocket, I'm likely to spend that money somewhere. Therefore, that economic growth ensues. This is another just anecdotal part. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, tax changes do have very large effects. So an exogenous tax increase of 1% of GDP can lower or will lower real GDP or economic growth by roughly 2 to 3%. All right. If we look at the corporate tax rate, the impact to economic growth. So a corporate tax rate decrease, as you see. So if the corporate tax rate was decreased to 20%, okay, you'd have a positive impact of about 0.08% to GDP. But according to the Tax Foundation, if you had a 28% corporate rate, that would have which is I think what the Harris proposal was, a negative 0.6% offsetting factor to GDP. So that's why these tax rates is something we're going to keep a very close eye on. Because depending upon tax policy will start feeding into forecasts for economic growth and therefore market returns. But let's balance this all with, this is the 2024 federal budget, okay, which is $6.8 trillion. Trillion with a T. So total government spending, this is how it's broken down. 25% of government spending is on Medicare and Medicaid, 21% on Social Security, 14% on defense, 13% on non-defense discretionary, so other government programs. 13% of the federal budget is interest, paying interest on the debt. And then there's another 13% that's other, which I don't know that anyone knows what some of that is. So if you look at the sources of revenue, where is the money coming from for that $6.8 trillion? Well, if you break it down, here's the essentially income. This is the individual tax income, corporate tax income, social insurance, so that's the FICA taxes and such, small amount in other government fees and tariffs and things like that. And then 28% of the budget is being funded through new issuance of debt. Okay? So this is a well-publicized problem. But if you think about it, 13% of the budget of spending is paying interest on the debt. So if you think about it, a lot of the borrowing that we're doing, okay, is to pay interest on the borrowing we're doing. So there are some reforms that are going to happen at some point. Okay? So hopefully we'll get some balance between tax policy and spending policy so that some of this can start coming more in line. But this is why you can't change tax policy too terribly much, right? Because there's a lot of, the government has to fund itself. All right, a few more charts and then we're done. So I've talked a little bit about that Tax Cut and Jobs Act and what might happen under different administrations. But what is the impact to that deficit? And this is why this is going to be a wrestling match in Congress next year. You're going to hear a lot about it. Because if they extend the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, what you see here is that it does forecast, at least initially, to increase the deficit relative to if they expire and go away. Okay? The last thing I'll show you is the reason all of this is incredibly important, and this is a very interesting chart to me, is that over time, this dates back to the 1950s, households are owning more and more stock as a part of their household assets. There's a lot of reasons for this. The accessibility of buying stocks has increased. Pension funds have kind of gone by the wayside, so people are funding retirement through 401ks more than they were, pension income in the past. So there's a lot of reasons for this. But the amount of stock ownership in households today is approaching 45%. And so what that tells me is there has to be and will be a very difficult balancing act between whatever policies come out of the U.S. Congress and the presidency to balance tax policy, its effect on the economy, which ultimately is the effect on stocks and household wealth. So here are what I would say the key takeaways are from our conversation today. The first thing is I think it's reasonable to expect volatility over the next 60 days. I think making significant investment changes based upon the election is not a prudent strategy. Don't make big bets one way or the other. Don't head for the hills. Again, if you're a client of ours, right, we're constantly looking at whether we should make tweaks to investment portfolios. We've done some recently, but really we're not making full-scale changes based upon a perceived election outcome. According to current data, there's a very high probability that we will have a divided government regardless of who wins the presidency. Okay? So going back to the original framers and the concept of a checks and balances system where you have House of Representatives, the Senate, and presidency, this probably means there's not going to be a lot of huge policy changes to come out because whoever wins, one party is going to have enough control to block some things. It's very likely that in a couple years' time, by 2026, we're going to have a very, very different tax policy. Okay? The other thing I'll share, and where I was going with this comment is, the tax proposals that you hear and you see from the Trump campaign, the Harris campaign. Historically, what happens is those proposals and what actually policy takes place tend to be very different. Okay? They are campaigning right now. They're putting together what they think their base wants to hear. But the actual tax policy that may take place after it goes through all the levels of Congress is usually going to be much different. So I wouldn't get too hung up on any certain tax policy. For instance, there was some banter around whether unrealized gains would be taxed in the future. Unrealized gains are just that. I bought something, it's increased in value, but I haven't sold it yet. And so there's, among the Democrat side, there's some people that have floated around that those unrealized gains should be taxed. I think the likelihood of that happening is extremely low, and it's not something you should put a lot of bandwidth in. Going back to my point, stuff you're hearing now and what actually will take place in terms of tax policy could be very different. And then, this is a big one. The expiration of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act is a critical item that you need to pay attention to. Okay? There's probably going to be a webinar or something we do once we have a little bit of certainty on the election, and once we start early next year, maybe getting a little bit of understanding on what might happen. You may need to make some decisions, and we'll go through what those decisions might be. And then lastly, the last takeaway is tax policy will have a significant influence on economic growth and market returns. So depending upon where things go, we're keeping a very close eye on what that is projected to do based upon market returns in the future and economic returns. So with that, I'm going to leave it, and we're right at 45 minutes. I want to thank you for your time, and if you have questions, email us, reach out to us. We're always happy to help, and I hope each of you has a great day. Thanks.